Will the predetermined failure of the globalist peace plan be used as justification for European nations to enter the war with Russia? Michael Snyder reports, why does every step forward seem to bring us even closer to an apocalyptic showdown with Russia? And now we're being told that the UK, France, and other European nations will be working with Ukraine to develop a plan to stop the fighting. We aren't even being given specific details about the plan yet, but there are two things that we do know. First of all, it will involve European troops on Ukrainian soil. In fact, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is already telling us that the British are ready to put boots on the ground. Secondly, the plan will almost certainly require the Russians give back large portions of territory that they have conquered. Of course, the Russians have already clearly stated they will never accept European troops on Ukrainian soil, and that no territory that Russia is currently holding will be returned. In this case, the Russians have all the leverage because their troops are steadily moving forward. The bottom line is that the globalists know that there is zero chance that the Russians will agree to the peace plan that they're working on, so why put forward such a plan at all? Ultimately, I think the European leaders want to convince their population that they did all that they could before sending their own troops to the eastern Ukraine. And they know that this peace plan is not going to work. They simply want to justify what they're about to do. In the article I published just before this one, I outlined 3 options that Ukrainian President Zelensky is facing. Number 1, the first option would be to force Ukrainian President Zelensky to make peace with the Russians. Now that relations with the US have broken down, Zelensky cannot continue the war without European support. Of course, making peace with the Russians would mean giving the Russians just about everything that they want because the Russians have all the leverage right now. This option is untenable for the Europeans because it would mean losing the war and handing Vladimir Putin a major victory. 2, the second option would be to continue sending Ukraine cash and military equipment and hope for the best. Needless to say that this is not going to work. No matter how much cash and equipment the Europeans send to Ukraine, the Ukrainians will lose this war if they are forced to fight the Russians alone. In the end, the Russians would simply take as much of Ukraine as they felt like taking until they decided that they finally want to stop. That would be a worse outcome for the Europeans than option number 1. Number 3, the third option would be for European nations to enter the war directly. As I discussed in my previous article, this is what Zelensky desperately wants. The only way that Ukraine can win this war is if large numbers of Western troops are introduced into the conflict. But of course, if European nations start fighting Russia, that puts us right on the brink of nuclear war. Needless to say, nuclear war would be the worst outcome of all. Unfortunately, I think that the European leaders are rapidly moving towards option number 3. At the emergency summit that was held in London Sunday, UK Prime Minister Starmer discussed the plan to stop the fighting that European leaders will be working to develop. We've now agreed that the United Kingdom, along with France and possibly 1 or 2 others, will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting, and that will discuss that plan with the United States, Starmer told BBC, adding that he and Macron of France have both spoken to Trump since the latter's meeting with Zelensky. At Sunday's summit, European leaders will look towards shoring up the continent's defenses and defending Ukraine, including discussions to create a European military force and sent to the war-torn country to cap a ceasefire. Starmer suggested the military force would include a coalition of the willing, whatever that means. Ominously, Starmer told the press that UK is ready to enforce a ceasefire with boots on the ground and fighter jets in the air. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground, planes in the air. And when he was specifically asked about the potential for war with Russia, Starmer did not rule that out. Asked whether there is now more of a real prospect of Britain being at war with Russia, Sir Keir Starmer said, "The reason I've been forward-leaning on this is because I want to avoid conflict, because I do not want conflict in Europe, in Ukraine. I want stability in the United Kingdom." The way to ensure that stability is to ensure that we are able to defend the deal in Ukraine, because the one thing our history tells us is that if there is conflict in Europe, it will wash up on our shores. There's not going to be any deal in Ukraine, and they know that. The Russians have stated over and over again that no European soldiers will be permitted in Ukraine. Starmer very clearly understands what the Russian position is. If UK troops are sent to Ukraine, it won't be to defend a deal. It will be to fight a war. And as Mike Chernikov aptly pointed out, the British soldiers start unaliving in eastern Ukraine. There could be a way to draw the United States directly into the conflict. So what happens if Russia decides to start going against ships and other military targets that are far beyond Ukrainian territory? And what happens if the Russians start doing that are actually located inside British territory? Could the U.S. stay out of this in such a scenario? What we need is a peace plan that will work for everyone. At the moment, it's being reported that there is no deal in sight at present that would satisfy Mr. Putin. A Moscow foreign policy analyst who's close to the Kremlin said on Saturday that any delay to peace talks was likely to benefit Russia because there was no deal in sight at present that would satisfy Putin. The analyst insisted on anonymity because of the sensitivities in Moscow of speaking to Western journalists. And there's no deal in sight that would satisfy Zelensky's absurd demands either. So we need to be very honest about what is really going on. The Russians and the Ukrainians are not even in the same universe when it comes to what an acceptable peace agreement would look like, and meanwhile Russian forces just continue to gobble up more territory. Now, if European leaders were serious about peace, it would be so easy to come up with a framework for a realistic deal. A ceasefire would freeze the front lines where they are currently. Ukraine would be designated a neutral state and would be banned from joining NATO, and no European troops would be permitted in Ukraine. And that's what it would take to make a deal, because the Russians are clearly winning and the Ukrainians are clearly losing this. But the Europeans and the Ukrainians will never ever accept such a deal. Instead, they're going to put their own deal forward, even though they already know that it will fail. And when it does fail, it will give them justification for the quote-unquote next steps that have already been decided upon. One British pundit just declared that we are now at war with Russia, and that should chill all of us to the core. Because once the UK is officially against Russia, it would not be too long before the US follows suit. This is on End of the American Dream by Michael Snyder. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. This is by Michael Snyder, and about the author. Michael Snyder's new book entitled Why is available on paperback and for Kindle on Amazon. He's also written 8 other books that are available on Amazon, including Chaos, End Times, 70 Apocalypse, Lost Prophecies of the Future of America, The Beginning of the End, and Living a Life That Really Matters. When you purchase any of Michael's books, you help to support the work that he's doing. You can also get his articles by email as soon as he publishes them by subscribing to his Substack newsletter. Michael has published thousands of articles on the Economic Collapse blog, End of the American Dream, and the Most Important News, and he's always freely and happily allowed others to republish those articles on their own websites. These are such troubled times and people need hope. John 3:16 tells us about the hope that God has given us through Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. If you have not already done so, we strongly urge you to invite Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior today. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.